welcome Stéphane to Peace Day Live 2023.
Thank you, Jeremy. Great to be here with you.
So the first thing I'd like to ask you, and thank you firstly for giving up time today for the show, because of course it's the opening of the General Assembly and you must be extremely busy. So I'm going to get straight to it, but thank you for giving up this incredible time of yours. Could you tell us about your journey and becoming the spokesperson for the Secretary General of the United Nations?
Well, I mean, it's been a privileged journey. It's been an amazing journey, but it's one that was anything but planned. I was, I think, in the right place at the right time at different times in my life. I never thought I would end up here. I started out as a journalist working for ABC News in the late 20th century, covering as a field producer conflicts in East Africa, in the Balkans, in the Horn of Africa, in different places. And I often came across UN people, International Red Cross people, and I thought that was, it was interesting work. And it seemed to be valued work. But I never really did much about it until 1999. Somebody said to me, you know, they're looking for a spokesperson, junior spokesperson of the UN, and I applied out of the blue, and I got the job and started working as associate spokesperson for Kofi Annan, the late Kofi Annan, who was really a tremendous human being to have had the privilege to work for. And when my boss retired in 2005, it was at a really dark time for the UN. It was post-Iraq war. It was a difficult time for Kofi Annan. And my sense is that they tried to get some big name to take the job and nobody would. And so they looked at me and said, all right, you give it a try, give it a shot. And that's how I got here. And it's been an amazing journey, 23 years at the United Nations. This is my 23rd General Assembly. Never gets old. Does get more and more exhausting, but it never gets old. And I've really not looked back ever since.
It's absolutely incredible, Stéphane. I mean, obviously I've been to the United Nations many times. And of course, for me, the United Nations is the closest organization we have to holding the world together. So, well, what an incredible journey you're on, and the very best of luck with supporting the Secretary Generals in the future as well. So the next thing that I'd like to ask you is, what does a typical day look like for the spokesperson of the Secretary General of the United Nations?
The day starts often before the sun rises. Myself and other members of my team start working between 5:30 and 6 a.m. on putting together a news summary for the Secretary General, so he gets a kind of a flash, a view of what is being said in the world in different conflicts about the UN, what he needs to know of what media is saying all over the world. We get inputs from our offices everywhere around the world, and early morning we put those things together. I have the chance to brief him every morning. I go through the day's news. It's also my chance to ask him questions that I think I may be asked at our daily press briefing. We do a press briefing for every day at noon for we have about 150 or so journalists that are permanently accredited to the UN. They don't, thank God, all come to the briefing. But we put together this press briefing really as an act of transparency. I'm a firm believer that as a publicly funded institution, we have a responsibility to be accountable. And one of the ways of being accountable is putting yourself out there in front of the press. So we spend the first half of the briefing kind of telling them what we want to talk to them about, and then the second half is the return volley, so to speak, and they ask me questions about things that I sometimes don't want to talk about, but I have to talk about. Then the rest of the day is spent dealing with journalists more on a one-to-one basis and planning the Secretary General's travels. Either myself or one of my colleagues is always with him when he travels, so that demands a lot of preparation. It's a very reactive job. There's a lot of talk about strategic communications, which is very important. What I do, what my team does, is tactical communications, is ensuring that we survive till the next day, to fight another battle and to fight another day. And then the day ends whenever I have the courage to put my phone away, usually around 11 p.m. or or midnight after I walk my dog.
Absolutely incredible. Incredible. Okay, so it's Peace Day. 21 September, the International Day of Peace, the UN International Day of Peace, so happy Peace Day. But I want to ask you, why is this day so important, Stéphane?
Well, it helps us refocus on what is really the cornerstone of anything we want to build in the world. Any structure, any program, any project we want to build has to start with peace. It's that first brick. Because if that is not laid with strong foundation, everything else crumbles. You can't talk about health systems, you can't talk about educational systems, you can't talk about human rights if there is no peace. And we talk about peace every day, we need to talk about peace every day, but I think it's very useful to have one day a year when we really refocus our mind to what it actually means, what that world actually means, which is peace is a space in which people can thrive, in which people can grow, in which they're respected, in which their human rights are guaranteed. And I think that, to me, that's what the day means.
Very interesting. And of course, you know, Stéphane, that I'm really into constructive narrative. You know, you know that I'm into informing, inspiring, and engaging people towards impact through, you know, constructive narrative. And of course, I know that you'll feel exactly the same. And why is that? Well, maybe because we're partly concerned about the way in which, if it bleeds, it leads. And I wanted to know, how difficult do you find getting the good news and the amazing work of the United Nations out there to the people of the world?
Well, it's a very fine line, right? And I think coming from journalism, especially television journalism, where that the sentence you utter, if it leads, it bleeds, is unfortunately, sadly true. I think in terms of the Secretary General and his message, he often needs to grab people's attention with a dramatic message. I mean, I think if you listen to the way Antonio Guterres talks about climate change, it's very honest, but it's very drastic and somewhat dire. But every time we talk about things that are scary in a way, we also need to talk about solutions. And that really is the way Antonio Guterres, I think, approaches the way he speaks and the way he communicates, is that you want to grab people's attention with the drama, but then not to scare them into thinking that they can't do anything, right? That they are paralyzed with fear. So, excuse me, we also need to give them a message of hope, of this is what you can do. These are the actions you can take. These are the pressures you need to put on those who lead you to take make the national policy decisions that are important. So we need to have a little bit of both, because unfortunately good news doesn't always get people focused. Bad news gets people's attention, but bad news enough, I think, leads to inaction, underscoring the fact that people are resilient, people are capable of doing good. I mean, I was listening to the previous speaker, the former British soldier, who talked about how the greatest acts of kindness he's seen are those in conflict zones. And I think we need to show that people, while they may be victims, they are not without agency and without the ability to act.
Stéphane, you've seen a lot. You know what's happening in the world. I want to know, how do you see the future? Do you think our world leaders, do you think humankind has the ability to be able to turn this around? Because quite frankly, we've been on a pretty downward trajectory for a little while now, where we don't seem to be learning the extremely important, obvious lessons that we should learn. So, I mean, what's your outlook, and where do you find your hope?
My outlook is a positive one, because I think it has to be, right? We can't move forward without a positive outlook. We need to continue to be determined. And if you look at the first words of the Charter, it is "we the people are determined." Determined is a critical word within the UN context. And it's not about being optimistic or pessimistic, it's about being determined that things can get better. But for that, we need compromise, we need courage, we need real action from our political leaders. But we also have to study history and realize there have been other very difficult, challenging times in history, very dark times, from which people have rallied and gone on to build a better future. So I think it is increasingly, it is vitally, let me put it that way, vitally important to remain hopeful, but not to be complacent. That hope you need to work towards that hope, you need to work towards a better future. I think the worst thing that we can have in terms of approaches is complacency and hopelessness.
And where do you draw your hope from? I mean, you've seen a lot. Very sadly, some of your friends, the peacekeepers, have lost their lives. But you've seen as well a lot of very successful initiatives that the United Nations have run that made an incredible difference to countries around the world. So I'd like to know, where do you draw your hope from?
I draw my hope, one part of the hope I draw from is from going out into the field with the Secretary General and seeing the difference that we actually make when we feed people, when we house people, when we build hospitals and we build schools, and allowing people to rebuild their lives, and how quickly lives can be rebuilt and life can start again. I get hope from the colleagues that I see in the field who are far from home, but are still extremely dedicated. I remember being in northern Uganda a few years ago, where the refugees from South Sudan were coming in, and I met a young man named Allah who works for the refugee agency, and he was from Aleppo. I mean, he was from Syria, and while his city was being bombed in the middle of a civil war, he was in Uganda helping other people. That very much gives me hope. And when I see colleagues even at headquarters, I'm French, grew up here. I didn't really have a very challenging life, to say the least. But when I meet colleagues who are former refugees, who grew up in refugee camps, went to UN-run schools, and are now here giving back, all of that gives me hope.
Can I ask you, Stéphane, sometimes when I listen to people talk about the United Nations, and I hear them talk about the courageous men and women that work in the Secretariat and all over the world, and they seem to talk about the individuals that are working at the United Nations as if they hold the power. And I think sometimes that people don't understand that actually the power and control is with the member states, and that there's just these courageous men and women working for them, and they can only do what the member states tell them. Well, and I find that very interesting. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And is there anything that you get frustrated about sometimes and think, I wish people understood this about our work?
Well, because I think, we have a great communications challenge. On one hand, the flag behind me with that logo is one of the world's most recognizable logo. Just like when you see the star on a three-pointed star on a car, it's a Mercedes. The difference between the UN and Mercedes is that at the UN we have no brand management by design. So many people and institutions can speak on behalf of the UN. And I think it's important for people to understand that the UN is more than the Security Council. It's more than just the General Assembly. And when there is paralysis in the Security Council, as we see today for all the reasons that we know, it doesn't stop the UN in terms of its staff from acting. Even though the Council isn't united in speaking out against the war in Ukraine, we still have 1,000 or more UN staff in Ukraine delivering humanitarian aid. The same thing in Syria. We have 100,000 peacekeepers throughout the world, colleagues from World Food Program, the UN Refugee Agency, who are all over the world risking their lives. And they are risking their lives while those political leaders are trying, or not always succeeding, in finding political solutions. So the story of the UN is a complicated one. The narrative is complicated, and the simple and negative narrative is very easy. The more positive or even neutral narrative takes time to explain, and we have to unpack it. And I think it's one of the reasons I'd like to do these interviews like we're doing now, is we always need to explain what the UN is and what the UN is not.
Yeah, interesting. You talked about the Mercedes logo because that 3-star is the air, the land, and the sea. When the man originally, created that logo, and I think sometimes people also don't understand that the reason why in our airs planes don't hit each other, or on our seas boats don't hit each other, or where we get our post, on the land, it's because of the United Nations. There's so much that you do that I think people don't know.
Right. Exactly. There's a whole normative part of it. And you're right. The fact that, a plane can take off from London and land safely in Kuala Lumpur is thanks to the UN Civil Aviation Organization. The fact that you can put a letter in the post, from Kampala and have it land in Riyadh is thanks to the Universal Postal Union. All these little normative things that enable us to live the global lives that we lead are thanks to the United Nations.
Thank you, Stéphane, for your time, and thank you to the United Nations for looking after all of us in all those different kinds of ways that we've spoken about today. We wish you the very best with this incredibly important week, and for being the spokesperson of for the United Nations. Thank you, Stéphane, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.